All right, man, peace. So it's very common whenever you have sports debates or sports conversations for people to compare players from different eras and also to compare all-time great teams from different eras. People want to know, how would the 86 Celtics fare against the 2001 Lakers? How would the 83 Sixers do against the 2004 Pistons? Things of that nature. And then people like to compare dynasties. You have the Celtics dynasty of the 60s. You have the LA Lakers dynasty of the 80s, the Bulls of the 90s. And now, of course, in the 2010s, you have the Golden State Warriors. And for those of us who remember in 2016, when the Warriors went up 3-1 on the Cleveland Cavaliers, in the post-game presser, I believe it was Steph Curry and Klay Thompson who were sitting at the dais. And one of the reporters asked Klay Thompson how he felt like the Warriors would fare against the 87 Showtime Lakers, which is probably the greatest team of the last 35 or so years, the 87 Lakers, in my view. I mean, of course, you also have the 89 Pistons, you have the 83 Sixers, you got the 86 Celtics, you have the 96 Bulls, so on and so forth, 2001 Lakers. A lot of great teams over the last 35 plus years. But the 87 Lakers are probably the best of those teams over the last 35 or so years. But that's certainly up for debate. So, of course, Klay Thompson stated that he felt like the 2016 Warriors would beat his father's LA Lakers of 87. I say his father because Klay Thompson's father is Michael Thompson, who also was himself a #1 overall draft pick. The 87 Lakers, I believe, may still be the only team in NBA history to have 4 #1 draft picks on the same team, with Kareem, Magic, James Worthy, and Michael Thompson. And as we know, in the aftermath of going up 3-1, the Warriors lost to the Cavaliers in 7. Well, now, once again, with the Warriors up 2-0, the question is being asked whether or not they would have beaten the 96 Bulls. So, of course, they're going to talk about it. I'm going to chime in.
Let's get into it here, guys. So Golden State obviously has a good shot of winning 3 titles in 4 years. They've got 4 All-Stars on that squad. Dan, are the Warriors, when healthy, the best team in NBA history?
Let me say this very quickly. All great teams have to be evaluated and appraised based on the era that they're in, because the style of the generation in which a great team plays is going to be a heavy determinant in how great they are and how well they would have played against other teams. That's why it's very difficult to say this team would beat that team and so on and so forth, because the game is officiated differently. The styles are played differently. Coaches coach differently. The 96 Bulls, for example, they had a 3-point line that was brought in by 1.5 feet or so. In this era today, you don't have any real post play. So it also depends on how the game would be officiated. Do I think that this Golden State Warriors team is the greatest team ever or the greatest team that I've ever seen? No. They're definitely up there. As I've already stated, I think that the 87 Lakers are probably the best team that I can remember seeing. Either them or probably the 96 Bulls in regards to how harmonious they are. Now, in regards to overall talent, the best Bulls team was probably the 92 team. But in regards to how harmonious they were, the 96 Bulls were the best team because there were no egos on that team. Everyone knew their role and they executed their role. The first 3-peat Bulls team was filled with players who thought that they should have been starting. B.J. Armstrong, Scott Williams, so on and so forth. All these players thought that they should have been getting more time starting. Hell, even Stacey King thought he should have been starting. Will Perdue thought he should have been starting. But in my view, the 87 Lakers are still the best.
Well, they were the best regular season team before they added Kevin Durant. They were the best team I had seen since Michael Scotty and Dennis Rodman
I'll say this, the 2016 Warriors are probably the most fun team that I've ever seen, regular season-wise. They were the most fun team that I've ever watched.
And so they added Kevin Durant after that, and they do all the things those Bulls teams did well. They defend better than anyone, and they're better at a more valuable shot than anyone in Chicago ever was. So,
well, let me say this. The Warriors have what they call the Hamptons 5 lineup, with Steph, Klay, KD, Draymond, and Andre Iguodala. I would have loved to have seen the Hamptons 5 lineup go up against the Bulls lineup with Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Ron Harper, Dennis Rodman, and Tony Kukoc. That would have been a great matchup.
Yeah, I'd make the argument that this is the best team that I've ever seen.
How about they win a Game 4 against the Rockets tonight before we make them the greatest team we've all ever seen? How about that? I mean, every team that Michael Jordan played on that won a championship, all those teams are better than the Golden State Warriors, every one of them.
Let me say this. If they were allowed to play according to the defensive rules of the 90s, I would give the Warriors maybe a game. Maybe 2 games. I'll say 2 games. But according to the defensive rules of the 90s, where the Bulls will be allowed to play what they call the Doberman defense, be too much physicality.
You know, the blasphemy sometimes from Dan Leverton. I just don't understand this guy. Excuse me, like defense is not a part of it. You're trying to tell me that these Golden State Warriors, as great as they are at shooting the basketball, you're trying to tell me these Golden State Warriors couldn't be beaten by any of those old school teams? You got to remember, Dan, those old school rules come with it. You can get a little bit physical. You can hand check. You can do some things that you couldn't do in today's.
I would love to have seen Scottie Pippen guard or try to guard Kevin Durant. I think that Pippen would try to take a more cerebral approach to Durant, see if he could break him down mentally with trash talk and maybe some very physical defensive play. Durant has shown that he does have some weaknesses, some crevices in his psychological resume, especially if you can get up in him and you have good lateral footwork. He will descend into one-on-one play, which would play right into the Bulls' hands. And of course, that Draymond versus Dennis Rodman matchup would be one for the ages. Ron Harper, of course, would have his hands full with Steph Curry, but I think that Steph has shown over the years that when you get physical with him, he will fall back. And then, of course, you have the Michael Jordan versus Klay Thompson matchup, where, I mean, I'm just going to be real with you. Klay Thompson will be put into a torture chamber that he would never forget.
You'll get a technical foul for having bad breath in today's game, for crying out loud.
Stephen A., you've got a 2-time MVP, who's not the best player on his own team. You've got, you've got a team that Andre Iguodala.
And then let me not forget, you have Coach Steve Kerr against player Steve Kerr. Oh, and let me not leave out the Tony Kukoc versus Andre Iguodala matchup. Will be very fun to watch. I wonder if Tony played with Andre. I know that Kukoc was on the Philadelphia 76ers in the early 2000s, but did he get to play with Iguodala when Iguodala got there? One of you brothers can correct me on that.
Fifth best player. Like, go ahead and name. When you're talking about the 4th and the 5th best guys on those Bulls teams, you're talking about the Kerrs and the Paxtons. They're 2-time MVP. Is the guy who shoots from out there.
Tony Kukoc, you got Dennis Rodman on some of those teams. You got some very good players on some of those teams, and those Laker teams.
Why are you taking their side?
I don't know. I mean, I'm on
right.
Stephen A's side on this. Yeah.
Now listen, guys, the answer is the Bulls were better. They were also greater. Like, you never know because they didn't play each other. But the Bulls were a much more dominant team than the Warriors. They didn't lose any champion.
Especially mentally. Like, that would be the difference to me. The Bulls would just take them apart mentally. The championship level teams in that era were on a different level mentally. As I've stated ad infinitum on this channel, one thing that this era has in greater abundance are long-range shooters, as well as face-up handlers. A lot of the players today are very good in regards to their dribble, their handle, and the face-up game. The post-up game is severely lacking. And of course, a lot of the basketball IQ, mental acumen, and some of the toughness is also lacking. And I think that would show over the course of a 7-game series between the Chicago Bulls and the Golden State Warriors. They would try to incrementally break them down. But it'd be interesting to see some of the matchups, not just on the court, but also in regards to the cerebral approach. Steve Kerr versus Phil Jackson. What would Steve Kerr tell his team in regards to how he feels like they could defend Jordan or Scottie Pippen? As someone who was their teammate, I'm sure that he saw certain flaws psychologically that he would hope his team would be able to take advantage of.
Once they got going, once Jordan had a single all-star available to him in the games he played in the playoffs, they never didn't win the championship in under 7 games, guys. It's pretty clearly they also beat amazing teams, like this idea that Jordan's teams weren't as stacked with talent. The Penny Shaq.
They weren't playing against LeBron, Max. They weren't playing.
Thank you, sir. I've had a couple of these LeBron James super fans trying to go back and forth, and a lot of these guys, they're so easy to spot. They come on my channel and they might see a couple of videos and, You can tell when people are accustomed to using certain arguments, and you can also tell when people did not grow up in that era. They didn't watch a lot of those teams. One of these guys was going on about how it was not an achievement to beat the Shaq and Penny Orlando Magic because they got swept the year before by the Rockets. People don't understand that team, the Orlando Magic of the early to mid-90s, was very precocious. They were not supposed to get to the finals in 95, but they got so good so fast because of how great Penny and Shaq were in regards to their talent. It took them a while to understand the importance of the mental game catching up to the physical game. And they were in the midst of maturing in the 95-96 season, but unfortunately for them, they went up against a juggernaut in that 72-win Bulls team who were at their fullness mentally. And they totally cut off whatever chances that Orlando team had of becoming a champion because Shaq was already looking for his exit because he was tired of sharing the spotlight with Penny. And that was pretty much all she wrote after that in regards to that team. But there were plenty of great teams that the Bulls beat, not just on their way to the championship, but of course in the championship game. And a lot of these idiots try to talk about how Jordan never played anybody in the finals. All those teams were great. The Utah Jazz team was phenomenal. The Utah Jazz team was the same team that used to sweep the Lakers every season in the playoff. They would sweep them. And this was a team that had Shaq, Eddie Jones, Nick Van Exel, a young Kobe Bryant. They used to sweep them every season. They swept them, I believe, in 97 and 98. And in 99, I'm trying to remember who swept them. It might have been the San Antonio Spurs that swept the Lakers. But please keep in mind that in 1998, with a 35-year-old Karl Malone and a 35-year-old John Stockton, or 36 years old, however old he was, they defeated the San Antonio Spurs in 5 or 6 games. A Spurs team that had David Robinson and Tim Duncan. So that's how you're able to gauge or approximate how certain teams would fare against other teams when you have these athletes that cross over generations. Like we know Tim Duncan played in the Steph Curry generation. He also played at the very tail end of the Michael Jordan generation. So that's how we're able to gauge and approximate. So when these guys come on the internet and say, oh, well, you know, when we look at 90s basketball, those guys couldn't play today. A lot of these guys are morons. Great players can play in every era. And over a 20-year span, there's not going to be this quantum leap in talent that would stop players from 20 years ago from playing today. Now, we're going to talk about the players who were in the NBA in the late 40s into the early 50s before integration. This was before they were even investigating the full talent pool. So, of course, you could say that a lot of those players could not play today. But even the cream of the crop of that era in the mid-50s, those players could play today. Believe me, if T.J. McConnell and J.J. Barea could play in the NBA today, players from the mid-50s who were of the elite could play today. There's no doubt in my mind about that.
Against LeBron.
The Penny Shaq 60-win Magic with a good supporting cast who all knew their roles. Horace Grant.
The Rockets have the best offensive rating in the history of the sport.
Right, because analytics.
Right, those teams were pushed every single year. Those teams were pushed.
Because analytics have become more advanced and teams pay attention to them more. So if
Absolutely. Thank you for making that case, for making that point, Max Kellerman. Please keep that in mind when you try to refer to analytics as a prime resource. Let me say this. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, players would look at their stat sheet, of course, but they would look at their points, their rebounds, their assists. They weren't looking at things that players are knowledgeable of today, like your true shooting percentage and things of that nature. Like LeBron James is aware of all these things today. James Harden and the top general managers of many of these franchises are aware of higher level metrics. Players didn't pay attention to that shit back in the 80s and 90s. And interestingly enough, Michael Jordan is still the preeminent player, even in those high level metrics and analytics from back then. So that shows you what he could have done if he was more stat conscious in regards to these higher level metrics. And all great players are stat conscious. I don't care who they are. All great players are aware of what their assist numbers are, their rebounds, their points. Larry Bird stated he used to look at the newspaper just to see what Magic Johnson did stat-wise so that he could compare.
they will be better, but not as dominant in their own era as the Bulls were, and they don't, and you know, they don't have Michael Jordan either.
Max, how do you feel about this? Max and Stephen A., how do you guys feel about this? Because I have a personal record book, and in my personal record book, Kevin Durant has yet to win an NBA championship. He does not have a ring because up 3-1 in the Western Conference Finals, one of the two best players in the world could not close the Warriors out. So rather than come back and try...
Well, here's the first problem that you're having, sir. Kevin Durant was not one of the two best players in the world in 2016. Steph Curry was. And even though he was hampered, the Golden State Warriors were the better team. They were the better coach team. And I firmly believe that they did not even start to take the Oklahoma City Thunder seriously until they got blown out in Game 4. And that was their problem. They were far too arrogant. They played the 2016 regular season like it was the playoffs, and when they got to the playoffs, they had no level to raise their game to unless they were severely pushed. They had to allow themselves to be backed into corners so that they could galvanize themselves. They had to allow certain highly pressurized scenarios to occur to create and concoct an impetus for their team to be motivated to say, okay, we have to take these guys seriously. Kevin Durant is a very talented player, but he has to be in the right system that can move him towards winning, that can allow him to understand how to win, what a winning style is, because he never learned that. And that took place over a process of time. When he first came onto the Golden State Warriors, there was a period of transition where you could tell many of the more prominent members of the Golden State Warriors were struggling with how to bring him into the fold, how to make him understand the concepts that their team utilizes to optimize what they do out there on the basketball court. Because oftentimes he would allow himself to go into this one-on-one game that wasn't successful in Oklahoma City. And that's something that we all have to understand. If our process is not working, sometimes it's not about how hard you do it, it's about how smart your process is. Sometimes you have to scrap it. And even to this day, Durant sometimes struggles with that because he can go one-on-one with any player in the league and score. But it's a team game.
Can you imagine if Michael Jordan left the Bulls and joined the Pistons because he couldn't beat them by himself? Kevin Durant could not beat the Golden State Warriors by himself, so he left the Oklahoma City Thunder.
No, that's not why he left.
Players of the NBA.
Well, let me say this. If Michael Jordan was on the Bulls and he had a player that wasn't as good as him, that was hogging the basketball, like say Scottie Pippen was taking 20 shots a game and only making 40% of his shots, and was more concerned about getting triple doubles than playing a winning style of basketball, and the coach had them playing in a playground style where Jordan had to struggle to get the ball in clutch moments, he may have left the Bulls if given the opportunity.
No, he left. No,
that's not why he left. Stu, that's not why he left.
Max?
He left.
Max?
He left for the same reason that the Warriors wanted him, because LeBron is so great that the Warriors 73 win team couldn't beat him. Kevin Durant knew he needed to team, like the best team ever maybe in the regular season, teamed up with one of the 2 or 3 best players in the world and ever at his position in order to overcome LeBron.
Well, no, not really. In the aftermath of the finals, it looks like that, but in reality, they were courting Kevin Durant that entire season. They were not truly thinking about LeBron James. As a matter of fact, they did not consider the Cleveland Cavaliers a threat all the way into the finals. They were not thinking about LeBron James that year in regards to being concerned about him. They were just trying to up the ante to create a dynasty. Every time I watched the Oklahoma City Thunder play the Golden State Warriors, I would see Kevin Durant chatting with Steve Kerr. And this is when Kevin Durant was a member of the Thunder. So I knew that something was going on, and it didn't shock me at all. Well, I shouldn't say that. It didn't surprise me when he signed with the Golden State Warriors. It did shock me. You know, just because you start to think of certain players being associated with certain franchises. But it didn't really surprise me at all, because I saw it all throughout that season. And if I would have had a YouTube channel at that time, I would have been making videos about it.
LeBron was response that you're referring to.
But no. Listen, you have Russell Westbrook. You're up 3-1. Kevin Durant played horribly in games 5 and 6. Played good.
As did Russell Westbrook.
7, they lost that game. But in what world are we assigned? Like, in what world does this work in sports and we applaud it? I can't beat that team, so I'm going to join that team. Are you kidding me?
Well, we have not quite seen that paradigm, but we did see LeBron James say, I can't beat the Celtics, so I'm going to team up with my homeboy. People may say, well, that's not quite as extreme or that's not as bad, but let's also understand, it's not like Kevin Durant had a history of losing to Golden State. That was the first time that they had ever met in the playoffs. Durant actually had an issue losing to the Dallas Mavericks. Now, they fell by the wayside, and every once in a while, the OKC Thunder would have an issue with San Antonio, but they had beaten San Antonio as much as San Antonio had beaten them. It kind of just happened to be that during the playoffs, they met up with the Golden State Warriors. For those of us who remember, during the 2016 playoffs, OKC was supposed to lose to San Antonio. They got blown out the first game, and then they ended up coming back and defeating them. they had issues keeping leads that entire season because of poor execution in the fourth quarter. Whenever you have poor execution, that's a point guard issue. So they just ended up meeting up with Golden State, and of course they went up 3-1. They hadn't beaten Golden State in any of their 3 matchups during the regular season, and I believe that's why Golden State did not take them seriously until they lost Game 4. Remember, they split 2 games. They split the first 2 games in Golden State. I think that OKC won Game 1, where Golden State gave up a big lead in the fourth quarter and allowed OKC to come back. And then I think Golden State won Game 2, where Steph Curry dove into the crowd and bust his face. Something like that happened, or his elbow. No, his elbow. Maybe his elbow in his face. He had a big knot in his elbow. Then they go to OKC for Game 3. They get blown out. Blitzkrieg. I think Draymond, that's when he kicked Adams in the nuts. They let him play Game 4. They got blown out again. All of a sudden, they're down 3-1. And they come back to Golden State, and Curry has a big game. Then they go back to OKC for Game 6, and Klay Thompson just goes nuclear. Then they come back to Golden State for Game 7, and Steph Curry has a huge game, and that's all she wrote. And, of course, Kevin Durant struggled in Game 6. Because as talented as he is, a lot of his moves are very predictable, especially when you can get him in that one-on-one mode. And Iguodala was so smart, he was able to get both Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook into situations where he forced them into making very predictable offensive moves, and he stripped them. And they just didn't understand the mental aspect of the game, and I think that's why KD came to Golden State, to learn the mental aspect of the game. Because at that level, when you're talking about the conference finals to finals, it's about the mental difference. It's not about the physical.
Durant should be ashamed of
That
himself.
take is 2 years old. You're going on first take, and you're giving a 2-year-old take.
Because I wanted to see if Stephen A. and Max agree with me.
Well,
Max
first of
does not.
all, first of all, Stu Gotts knows, he knows I agree with him for that. Nobody was more outspoken about Kevin Durant going to the Golden State Warriors than me. So I agree with you there, but nevertheless, it doesn't take away from his greatness, the greatness we've witnessed from him on the basketball court. I have to concede he's one of the top 3 players on the planet. He's just surreal in his own right, and he deserves credit for that.
Stephen A. now calls Kevin Durant one of the top 3 players on the planet because I believe he has James Harden number 2. I have Steph Curry number 2.
Said all of that.
I mean, I waffle with it. Sometimes I have KD, sometimes I have Steph Curry. But as I stated, after a regular season game where Kevin Durant proclaimed that the reason why they were struggling was because they were missing Steph Curry, I said, well, I got to put Curry number 2 because even this nigga admits that Curry's number 2.
One of the things, Dan, getting back to you, when we're talking about these old school teams, I think we look at talent and we don't look enough at eras. At eras, if Golden State was in that era, where you're allowed to get away with more physicality than you could ever hope to get away with now, I could make the argument, Dan, that this Golden State Warriors team, as great as they are, would be entirely too frail to deal with Jordan and the Bulls from that era.
That's a very good point. Very apt, too. I just think that with the defense that was allowed, especially in the playoffs by the referees, like, the defense used to get so intense from the Bulls. I remember they played Orlando in the conference finals in 96, and they blew them out in Game 1. And then in Game 2, Orlando actually had something like a 15 or 18-point lead, middle of the third quarter, late third quarter. And the Bulls ratcheted up the defense, especially Jordan, to the point where they could barely get the ball across half court. Like, Orlando could barely get the ball across half court, man. Nick Anderson could not even deal with the basketball. Penny Hardaway was struggling bringing the ball up, and Penny Hardaway had one of the great handles of any player in NBA history, 6'6" and up. And he could barely get the ball across half court.
Argument I could make before I even get into talent.
But I can make the argument on the other end that an extraterrestrial like Kevin Durant didn't exist during Jordan's age. A 7-footer who could play from out there and make a more valuable shot than any that Michael was good at. I can make the argument.
Well, Larry Bird was 6'10", and he was just as potent from the outside as Kevin Durant. Now, Larry Bird was not a 90s player, so I understand what you're saying from that degree, but that would be a very interesting matchup, Kevin Durant versus Scottie Pippen.
Nobody Nobody's ever shot or dribbled the way Steph Curry does. No one of that era has ever. That physical play doesn't work. That's not going to work on the guys who are on the perimeter.
Durant is a unique, didn't exist back then. But Shaq and Penny with the supporting cast, 60 wins did. Kemp and Peyton with 64 wins on a great Seattle team did. Malone and Stockton on a perennial contender did.
Imagine Penny joining Michael Jordan's team, or imagine Shaq joining Michael Jordan's team.
More like
because
Barkley.
Kevin Durant is a top 20 player of all time.
Right.
It's more like it.
I wouldn't go that far. I don't know if I would have KD in the top 20 quite yet. I would have him and Steph somewhere around top 35, top 30. When we say top 20, that's pushing it. That's definitely pushing it. I mean, but I would probably have to do a list to go down that far. I'll say this. What would truly give the Bulls cause to pause, as Stephen A. Smith would say, is the fact that oftentimes they have Draymond as their point guard. So Draymond presumably would be guarded by Dennis Rodman. That would open up a lot of shooting lanes and, of course, a lot of freedom for Steph Curry and Klay Thompson off the basketball, because the Bulls love to pressure the basketball. It would be very difficult for them to pressure the basketball 94 feet when you have a Draymond bringing the ball up against a Dennis Rodman. When the Bulls try to trap, he can pass it off to a guard who could dribble even better than him, presumably a Steph Curry. That would throw off their trap a little bit. In that era, they didn't oftentimes allow a four-man to dribble like how the Warriors allow Draymond to dribble. So it will be interesting to see how the Bulls would pressure them for 94 feet up the floor with Draymond bringing the ball up.
There's not a perfect comparison, but it's more like Barkley joining Hakeem and Drexler. It's more like that. It's a response to the best player in the world, LeBron James, with a supporting cast, no one else having enough. So they're like, all right, let's team up, I guess. That's really what that's a response to.
Dan, I got a question for you. Before I let you go, Dan, because I know that you're a very, very busy man, and I just want to say I'm blessed.
Jealous, though, that you're asking me the question.
I'm blessed, Dan Leviton. I'm blessed to have you on this show today, sir. Let me ask you this question, Dan.
Thank you.
If Kevin Durant had elected to go to Miami instead of Golden State, would Kevin Durant and that Miami team have beaten LeBron?
Well, the funny thing about that, Stephen A., is that when Kevin Durant came to those meetings with the Miami Heat were making the argument in those meetings that, look, the degree of difficulty on the style of play that you're playing in Oklahoma City is too hard. We think you're the best basketball player in the world if the game would just be made easier for you.
Absolutely. That's interesting, the thought of Kevin Durant in Miami, because their culture is so strong down there. But what Stephen A. oftentimes leaves out once again is that Kevin Durant is not a leader. He doesn't want to lead. He didn't even want to lead in Oklahoma City. All he really wanted was to be regarded more. He thought that too much power was being given over to Westbrook. And he knew that his career was going to be evaluated and always linked, associated with Russell Westbrook and his bad decisions down the stretch of these games. So this is why he fits in so well with Golden State. Because the dominant personality on that team is Draymond, and Draymond doesn't want the ball. So that's really what he always wanted. He wanted to be on a team with someone else who wanted to be the leader, but who would give him the basketball. And that would not have been the case in Miami.
Brent took that information and is like, you guys are right. I'm going to Golden State. I want this game to be easier and more fun. So he took the information they gave him and he just went to a team that would help him make it easier.
That sounds good. I want to do that. I just don't want to do it with Goran Dragic.
That's right. I don't want to do it with Goran Dragic and Justice Winslow. I'll do it over with Steph Curry, Draymond Green, and Klay.
All right, Dan, Stugatz, a lot of fun. You guys need to join us more, but I'm being told we have to let you go.
That's a very interesting tidbit that was provided by Levitard. That's interesting. Because certainly, I've never understood this, and Stephen A. Smith's always trying to push this, but it's because, once again, he keeps trying to push Kevin Durant as an alpha personality just because he has alpha-level talent. When you make these evaluations, it's almost like when you're dealing with a female. She could be drop-dead gorgeous, but what's going on upstairs? What's going on in her spirit? What's going on with her personality? That's what's going to determine whether or not she's just a smang out or wife material. Stephen A. Smith does not understand Kevin Durant is like a dime piece physically. But when it comes to the mental, when it comes to the spiritual, he just doesn't have it. He has to be guided. And that's okay. As I've stated before, there's a certain nobility in understanding what your limitations are. But anyway, just getting back to the point, do I believe that the Golden State Warriors would beat the Chicago Bulls of the 90s, particularly that 96 Bulls team? No, I don't. Especially if they played according to 90s rules. Now, if they played according to these rules today, where oftentimes if you got too physical, especially with your hands, they would shut it down, that would be a far more potent series. It would be interesting to see how they would deal with a team that could stretch you out to 30 feet like that, because they were not accustomed to playing teams that far out. Now, every once in a while, during the regular season, if the Bulls would play a Denver Nuggets, like I remember there was a game where Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf just got blazing hot. They actually got up by 30-plus points. It was one of the games that the Bulls lost that year that they won 72 games. They were down by something like 30 points and then came back in Denver. And as we know, there are always issues with the altitude in Denver. But Jordan, of course, was in such immaculate condition. He was able to lead a comeback. They were down by like 30 points at the half, came back, took something like a 5-point lead early in the fourth quarter, midway through the fourth quarter, and then lost the game. I'm just thinking of other teams that they played that could have stretched them out like that. I mean, Seattle would stretch you out, but not like the Warriors. So that's another barbershop conversation, another Negro debate that has no real solution. It is what it is. But, it's fun to make those comparisons. Once again, in my view, the best overall team that I can remember seeing, even though I was very, very young, was probably the '87 Lakers. So peace.